Well, hi there. Social 30-1 here, going to take a look at the Cold War. This will be our topic for the week. Cold War is a tough one to fit into the course. It's important, but it never really fits in and flows with the rest of the course. I would typically teach this after chapter 5, which was our look at totalitarianism, but I wasn't sure how far we were going to get just because of the COVID crisis. But we have time. So I thought now would be a good time to learn about the Cold War. It's important, even though the Cold War is over today, and it's been over for quite some time, the world is very much the way it is today, though, because of the Cold War. And you will often hear references to the Cold War, historical references. So it's important that you know this, you understand it. Your parents would have grown up during the Cold War. I'm sure they're very well aware of it. It was a time where, you know, East and West didn't get along or trust each other at all. And by East and West, I mean East being communist Soviet Union, West being democratically capitalist America. They kind of drew the rest of the world into a vacuum. And you were either on America's side or the Soviet Union side. And for the era of the Cold War, which went from about 1945 to the late 1980s, it looked very much like there could be a World War III. A lot of people were certain there would be a World War III, and we lived accordingly. People lived in fear. They lived dreading the time when there was going to be a World War III, which of course would be a nuclear war. And that whole era of tension, of mistrust, of the threat of nuclear war created a whole genre of fiction, of music, and so on. That was the Cold War. So the entire James Bond film franchise was based on the Cold War era, as were a lot of other pieces of fiction, music, and so on. So it's something that everyone should really know about. In the old course, we'd spend about 2 weeks on this. Things have changed. We don't need to spend that kind of time on it. We'll spend about 3 classes on it, and that's enough to give you an idea of what the Cold War was and understand it and appreciate the way it affected history. So I've gone ahead and I've divided the Cold War lesson up into 4 different parts that we'll look over the next few days. Part one is just the establishment of the Cold War. What was it? Who was involved? Why were they at odds with each other? And I'll be about 20 minutes today here talking about it. Anyway, Cold War, ironic that they call it a war. They never actually shot at each other, so we use the word war loosely when we apply it to the Cold War. It wasn't a hot war. It wasn't a war where Americans were shooting at Soviets. They will fight against each other, but not directly. In other words, America will fight the Soviet Union, but what they're going to do is use other countries and other people to do that fighting kind of for them. We're going to call those wars proxy wars, but we're not quite there yet. That's still a couple of days down the road. So at the top of your picture, your page, you should see that very basic definition of the Cold War, a period of mistrust, um, suspicion between democratic capitalism of the West, represented by the USA, and of course dictatorial communism represented by the Soviet Union in the East. And as I said, they never actually shoot at each other. Setting for the Cold War, the climate was very simple. The end of World War II. World War II was devastating to Western and Eastern Europe. I mean, we often watch movies about the devastation that happened in Western Europe, shows like Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, and so on. But what we also need to understand is the war was equally, if not worse, in terms of its effect on Eastern Europe. And so the point we're trying to make here is that Europe is in ruins. Uh, Political disunity and chaos, and for certain economic disunity and chaos. Infrastructure has been decimated. Countries are without governments. It looked very, very bad for Europe at the end of World War II, 1945. Fascism was gone. So, of course, the Nazis at one point controlled almost all of Europe. And as you know, they were defeated by the end of World War II. And so, what that created was a power vacuum. In social studies and history, a power vacuum is when, a government is overthrown or defeated and no one's really in charge. And people are drawn to that power. They are are sucked into a void where they're trying to gain power and keep it from someone else. So a power vacuum happens at the end of a political revolution, or when a government falls, or when a country like Germany is defeated. There's a rush to see who's going to control the territory next. This can lead to civil war, sometimes genocide, but Europe is in the midst of a power vacuum. Out of World War II, there were really only two great powers left, and what are going to become known as superpowers. In other words, on the eve of World War II, Germany was a great power. Britain was a great power. France was a great power. America was a great power. The Soviet Union was a great power. But Japan was a great power. But by the end of World War II, they'd all been defeated, and if they weren't defeated, they weren't as powerful. By the end of World War II, all you've really got are two of those great power countries left, America and the Soviet Union. And they become superpowers. And I'm sure you've heard that term before. A superpower comes from the end of World War II. A superpower was either America or the Soviet Union. And what these two superpowers do is they begin to fill the power vacuum created by the chaos after the end of World War II. And so, as we've learned, after a political crisis, after an economic crisis, there's chaos, there's uncertainty and disunity. And what happens now is that, these two superpowers are going to fill the void created by that chaos and that crisis in Europe. The reasons why there's a Cold War, well, each side, the Soviet Union and the Americans, are looking to expand their ideology. They're seeking what is known as hegemony. Hegemony means that you're dominant. So they both want to be dominant political and economic powers on the world, especially in Europe, and they're trying to protect one another from each other. So the Americans are scared of the Soviets are scared of the Americans, and they're really afraid that the other ideology wants to consume them and destroy them. So the Americans are afraid, the Soviets want to destroy capitalism. The Soviets are afraid the Americans want to destroy communism. And so the way they try to protect and guard each other's ideology is by establishing hegemony. If you can be dominant, you can ensure the survival of your ideology at the expense of other ideologies. The way World War II ended as well makes this a very ripe climate for something like the Cold War. So you need to remember the way World War II ended, thinking back to Social 20-1. Um, America finally defeated Japan by dropping nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. And so many historians have wondered, did the Americans really need to drop those bombs to get the Japanese to surrender? Um, I've heard theories that they actually didn't, that maybe they dropped the bombs to scare the Soviets, to keep the Soviets out of Asia, to warn Stalin, look, this could be Moscow, this could be Stalingrad if we want it to be, so watch yourself, so be careful. And so, whatever tension there was between the Americans and the Soviets at the end of World War II, it's made worse by the way America ends its war with Japan. Atomic bombs. It's a threat to Stalin, and what it makes Stalin do is now he's got to rush into development his own atomic bombs to neutralize the American threat of their atomic bombs. So, in many ways, the use of those weapons at the end of World War II was a very destabilizing force on planet Earth. Countries that didn't have the bomb thought that maybe you had to get it to protect yourself from future aggression. We'll talk about that later. Ironically enough, during World War II, the Americans and the Soviets were actually wartime allies. So if you think back to your grade 11 history, the Axis powers were Germany, Italy, and Japan. And the Allied powers were Britain, America, and the Soviet Union. And so, ironically enough, the Americans and the Soviets were allies during World War II because they had a common enemy, the Nazis, Germany. Now that the Nazis have surrendered and been defeated in May of 1945, the common enemy's gone. And so now it's at this point that the Americans and the Soviets turn on each other. They don't need to get along anymore. They don't need each other. And now they actually go against each other. And so, in filling this power vacuum that we established earlier on in the lesson, what happens is actually quite simple. The Americans liberated Western Europe from the Nazis. As you see in movies, Saving Private Ryan and so on, Americans drive the Nazis with other countries out of Western Europe. And then they kind of just stay and they influence Western Europe. The Soviets liberate Eastern Europe. The Soviets drive the Nazis out of Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and so on. And after they drive the Nazis out, the Soviets just stay and they exert their influence on Eastern Europe. And that is how the power vacuum was filled at the end of World War II in these ways. The Americans helped liberate Western Europe, so they just stayed in the West. The Soviets helped liberate Eastern Europe, so they just stayed in the East. And that's kind of the establishment of the Cold War, at least territorial speaking. Motives, as we've kind of already talked about, um, the American motive for the Cold War, well, they're scared of communism. And when you think about the communist ideology, it is a threat to the American ideology. Capitalism is based on freedom, self-interest, individual rights and freedoms, and so on, the right to make money. Communism is the antithesis of capitalism. Communism, from an American standpoint, would be a threat to American capitalism. So you can see why the Americans would be scared of communism. So to try and quell that threat, the Americans expand their market. What the Americans do is as they liberate Western Europe from the Nazis, America makes it capitalist. So now you've got the American capitalist market economy in America and Western Europe. It's going to make the Americans a lot of money, um, making Western Europe a capitalist series of countries. The way the Americans are going to expand their sphere, their territory, is going to be known as dollar imperialism. In other words, America basically is going to bribe countries to fall under what we call their sphere of influence. A sphere of influence is when a country controls part of the world. So you could argue that today, you know, North America is under the American sphere of influence. And you could argue that Asia, is largely under the Chinese sphere of influence. So you don't directly control other countries in your sphere, but you certainly influence those countries within your sphere. And so the Americans during the Cold War are going to use money. They're basically going to bribe other countries to fall under their sphere of influence. Soviets will do it a different way, as we'll talk about right now. The Soviets are scared of capitalism, because from a Soviet perspective, from a communist perspective, a threat to capitalism or a threat to communism would be capitalism. So you can see why the Soviets would be scared of America and capitalism. Stalin will establish what is called a buffer zone to protect his sphere of influence. And I'll show you the buffer zone on a map in a few seconds here. The way the Soviets will expand their sphere is known as Stalinization, or sometimes they call it proletarian internationalism. A fancy way of saying you're going to invade and make them become like you. You're going to invade and make them practice communism, is what it basically is tantamount to. Uh, Stalin doesn't have the money to do what the Americans are doing. So Stalin very early on recognizes that he doesn't have the cash to use dollar imperialism like the Americans. So he's going to have to use another method. He's going to use brute force, which is called Stalinization. He's going to use his military and military aggression to expand the Soviet sphere of influence, which will eventually become Eastern Europe, only because he doesn't have the money to bribe. Um, talk about that in a bit. The Cold War doesn't just happen. There are a series of what are known as wartime conferences that percolate into the Cold War. And so remember that these wartime conferences happened during World War II. And it's at this point where America is actually aligned with the Soviet Union. So they're not quite enemies yet. So the first of these wartime conferences is in Tehran in 1943. Tehran is a city in Iran. It is a conference of the big three. And what they do at these conferences is they talk about how are we going to defeat Germany? How are we going to defeat the Nazis? You know, where are you going to attack from? Where are we going to attack from? And so on. They're known as the Big Three, and they're called the Big Three because the Big Three represent, is signifies by Stalin of the Soviet Union, Roosevelt of the United States, and of course Winston Churchill of Great Britain. That was the Big Three that met during these wartime conferences. So the first of these conferences, as I said, was Tehran, and they're talking about strategy, defeating Germany. It's at Tehran, actually, that Churchill warns Roosevelt of what Stalin's intentions are. Stalin has already said, listen, leave it up to me. I will liberate Eastern Europe from the Nazis. I will drive the Nazis out and give Eastern Europe their freedom. Churchill recognizes that for what it is. Stalin has no intention of giving Eastern Europe its freedom. He's going to liberate Eastern Europe and keep it for himself. Churchill realizes this, but he can't convince Roosevelt of the same. He can't convince Roosevelt to act. We call Churchill's suspicion, and Churchill even talks about this in a speech, in a very famous speech. His suspicion is symbolized through what is known as the Iron Curtain. He basically says an Iron Curtain has descended upon Europe that is dividing Europe in two, East Europe and West Europe. And I'll show you that on a map in a few minutes here. So big thing out of Tehran, Stalin promises that he will liberate Eastern Europe, and we use the word liberate loosely. Churchill recognizes Stalin's motives. He labels the plan the Iron Curtain, but he can't convince Roosevelt to act. And that's going to be important later. Next meeting is Yalta, which is in the Crimea. And this is later on in 1945, February of 1945. Again, it's a meeting, a conference of the Big Three, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. It's at this point, it's pretty clear by February 45, Germany is going to lose World War II. The Allies are going to defeat them. And so it's at this conference they start talking about, well, what are we going to do with the map of Europe? Like, who gets what? Who's going to get to control what? So as early as Yalta, it's obvious the Germans are going to lose, and they're planning the post-World War II map of Europe. They decide Germany is going to be divided into four different zones. And I'll draw a rudimentary little uh, symbol of this. So they're going to take Germany, pretend that looks like Germany. Bear with me now. They're going to divide Germany into four different zones. Americans are going to get a piece of Germany. The Soviet Union is going to get a piece of Germany. France is going to get a piece of Germany. And Britain is going to get a piece of Germany. The thinking is that we're going to defeat Germany. Germany will be politically devastated. It's going to be economically devastated. And so to prevent, a World War III, in other words, one could argue that because Germany was so devastated after World War I, that's what gave, the Nazis and Hitler their chance to rise to power and do what they did. The thinking was, let's not leave Germany destabilized after we defeat it in World War II. We're each going to take a piece of Germany. We're going to rebuild our piece. We're going to rebuild infrastructure, get people back to work, rebuild houses, and so on. And then after a given period of time, after Germany can be self-sufficient, each country is going to leave Germany alone and give it back its independence. They don't want to leave Germany destabilized because they don't want to have to come back and do this again. They don't want to have to fight Germany down the road in a future war because they left it destabilized. And we've talked about that already in Social Studies 30-1. Remember Thomas Carlyle and the crisis theory. Dictators really only come to power in time of a crisis. So the thinking is if we remove the crisis, if we each babysit and rebuild our section, there will be no crisis, and we won't have to come back and do this again. And so what's going to happen is the Soviets are going to rebuild the Soviet Union at the expense of their portion of Germany. So the Soviets aren't going to rebuild their section of Germany at all. They're basically going to rob it, they're going to loot it to rebuild the Soviet Union. You can't really blame them. The Soviet Union was devastated by the Nazi invasion in 1941. It cost them about 20 million Soviet people to defeat the Nazis during World War II. And they lost a lot of infrastructure in the meantime. So that's their motivation. It's hard to blame them, given what they went through for World War II. The Americans do indeed reconstruct their zone, so do the British, so do the French. Their motive isn't as noble as you think. So rather than looting Western Germany and Western Europe, the Allied countries, the US, Britain, and France, do indeed rebuild their sections and they rebuild infrastructure, but they're not doing it just to be nice guys. They're afraid that if they leave their section in ruins and chaos, that there's going to be a communist revolution in Germany, a communist revolution in Belgium. So they do make good on their promise. They rebuild their zones and they give them their freedom and independence, but the motives weren't as noble as you're thinking. They're scared that if they leave it devastated, there's going to be a communist revolution, and that's the last thing the Americans would want at the end of World War II. There is one final wartime conference, and that is Potsdam. Potsdam is a city in Germany in July of 1945. By July, the Nazis are officially defeated. Hitler killed himself. The Nazis are done. And another, I guess a big change is that Roosevelt is no longer part of the Big Three. Roosevelt actually had died and was replaced by Truman. And there's a picture of Truman in the new photo of the Big Three. Stalin, Churchill, and Truman. It's at, Potsdam by 45 that it's pretty obvious there's now a new era of history, and it is the Cold War. Berlin and Germany are officially split. There is now an East Germany that is run by the Soviet Union. There is a West Germany that is monitored by the Americans. And I'm going to talk more about the split of Germany and Berlin in the next lesson. But just understand that Germany is split up between America and the Soviets, and so is the city of Berlin split up between the Americans and the Soviets. It's actually quite fascinating. Um, that'll be in part two. And what they also begin to do at this point is they try to denazify Germany. They want to remove the Nazis from history. They want to remove all remembrance of the Nazis. So they tear down all the flags and burn them. They blow up Nazi statues and statues of swastikas, etc. And you can never really kill an ideology. You can never really kill an idea because it's not a physical thing. But they do try to denazify Germany because it went so wrong, because it was so bad, because of what it stood for. But they were never completely able to do that. Finally, at Potsdam, they recognize one another's sphere of influence. And what I mean by that is that the Americans recognize there's going to be a Soviet sphere of influence, and the Soviets recognize there's going to be an American sphere of influence. And there's nothing we can really do about that. At issue was Poland. Don't forget that Poland was not the reason for World War II, but the Allied countries, Britain and France, didn't declare war against Germany until Germany invaded Poland in 1939. And here we are in 1945, and they're going to have to give up Poland to the Soviets and Stalin. They weren't willing to go fight World War III over Poland in this case, so poor old Poland, and on the eve of World War II, the Nazis had invaded and conquered Poland, and then by 1945, Poland still doesn't have independence. Now the Soviets are basically running Poland, as you will see as we look at the Cold War. Interesting map that you need to understand, and we'll stop it after this map. There's Europe, 1945. Give you a few seconds to absorb the map. It's actually just out of your textbook, no big deal. So what we're looking at here is a map of Europe that is showing you each side's sphere of influence. So everything you see in brown, all of the brown countries, are under the American sphere of influence. They, by and large, are going to be democratic. They're going to be capitalist. Look what they've done with Germany. It's been split in two. There's a West Germany under the American sphere. There's an East Germany under the Soviet sphere. All the brown countries are the American sphere. They forge a military alliance called NATO. 1949, NATO. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They're going to defend democracy. They're going to defend themselves against Soviet aggression from the East. All of the striped countries are independent on a map, but really it's the Soviet Union that's calling the shots in these countries. So looks like they're independent on paper. They're not really. It's the Soviet Union that is calling the shots for these guys. So the countries that you see in stripes are known as Soviet satellites. Those are the Soviet satellite countries. And you're going to hear that word time again in our look at the Cold War. They are under the Soviet sphere of influence. They're all dictatorships. They are all communist countries. They don't want to be, but they don't have much choice now, do they? There's not much they can do to stop this from happening. A couple of countries will try to fight for independence, but they're going to be defeated very badly. So by and large, none of them really try to shake off the Soviets for the next few decades. But that map is showing you each side's sphere of influence. Western Europe is under the American sphere. Eastern Europe is under the Soviet sphere. By the way, if you remember me talking about Churchill warning of an iron curtain, so here's that word iron curtain over here, here's what he's referring to. It's just the border between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. He's just talking about the border between dictatorship and democracy, communism and capitalism. Over time, there will be a physical iron curtain. It's just a really long, highly guarded, electrified fence. Because as you're going to learn, if you lived on this side, it was really tempting to escape to the democratic side. And the Soviets knew it. So to keep you from leaving, they put up physical barriers to keep you in the sphere of influence that was Eastern Europe. But that's a separate lesson. We'll talk about that later. But that is your Iron Curtain. That's what Churchill was referring to, the separation between the two Europes. One sphere of influence, the other sphere of influence. By the way, if you've ever heard of the terms first, second, and third world, they come from the Cold War. The first world, during the 40s, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, first world applied to countries that sided with the Americans. They were democratic and they were capitalist. The second world referred to countries that sided or were taken over by the Soviet Union. They were the second world. They were usually by and large dictatorships and they were communists. The third world didn't really belong to either. So, hemisphere, continents like Africa were part of the third world. They weren't really either under one sphere of influence or the other. They were your third world. Over time, the first world became very prosperous because they practiced capitalism. Over time, the second world did not do as well economically because they were practicing communism. And we've already learned about that and why it was slower and quite often didn't work when compared to capitalism. Most people don't know that, but now you do. Famous piece of artwork from the Cold War. I don't understand it either. I mean, I can get bits and pieces of it. I think the color tones are red, brown, yellow. Quite often, signs of violence, death, bit of a morbid undertone to it. Um, it's obviously abstract. Doesn't really, show anything physically in detail. But what I see when I look at it is chaos, And if you look really close, you can see what might be people, what could be deemed as people. I'm not sure. Maybe that's just the way I'm seeing it. But what you're getting is a very chaotic picture. And it's trying to show you the tumultuous time that was the Cold War. There was a lot of uncertainty. People were scared. They were worried there was going to be a nuclear war. They were worried that that might be their last day on Earth. And on some occasions, it looked like, in fact, that could be true. I've just always liked the piece of art for its use of color and the way it conveys the chaos of the Cold War, um, the possibilities of the Cold War. Okay, we'll look at part two next time. We'll start studying a bit more specifically what happens in Germany and begin to look at some of the proxy wars. Good job today.